The police cruiser pulled up to my lakeside cabin as Margaret Thompson stood there pointing at my pickup truck like she had discovered a crime scene. Her face was flushed red with anger, and she was practically vibrating with righteous fury as she marched toward the officers. "Officers, thank goodness you are here. This man is trespassing on private property and refuses to leave." I stood there holding my coffee mug, watching this woman who had moved into my neighborhood 5 years ago trying to have me arrested for parking outside my own home. She had no idea that every street she walked on, every house she passed, and every single regulation she was about to quote had been created by me 15 years earlier. The irony was almost too perfect. Margaret Thompson was about to learn that the person she was trying to kick out of the neighborhood was the same person who built it from the ground up. That was when I realized this was going to be a very interesting morning. My name is David Mitchell, and after 35 years in residential development, I had finally achieved my dream. I was moving into Lakeshore Meadows, the crown jewel of all the communities I had ever built. The irony was not lost on me that I was buying back property in a neighborhood I had created from scratch 15 years earlier. Back in 2009, I had purchased 200 acres of pristine lakefront property and spent 2 years planning every detail of what would become the most beautiful residential community in the county. I designed winding streets that followed the natural contours of the land. I positioned each home site to maximize lake views while preserving mature oak trees that had stood for decades. I even hand-selected the native plants for the landscaping. The lake cabin I was moving into had always been my personal favorite. It sat on a small peninsula that jutted into the crystal-clear water, surrounded by towering pines and overlooking the entire lake. When I first built it, I had secretly hoped to keep it for myself, but the economics of development meant I had to sell every property to make the project profitable. The original buyer was a retired couple from Chicago who loved the place as much as I did. They lived there happily for 12 years before deciding to move closer to their grandchildren. When their real estate agent called to tell me the property was going on the market, I did not hesitate for even a second. At 62 years old, I was ready to step back from the demanding world of construction and development. I had built over 40 neighborhoods throughout the state, but none had captured my heart like Lakeshore Meadows. Now I could finally wake up every morning to the sound of water lapping against the shore and watch the sunrise paint the lake in shades of gold and orange. The day I moved in, I drove slowly through the neighborhood, admiring how well everything had aged. The landscape had matured beautifully. The homes still looked fresh and well-maintained. The common areas were pristine. I felt a deep sense of pride seeing how my vision had become reality and how well it had stood the test of time. I remembered creating the homeowners association structure as an afterthought. My lawyer had insisted that every modern development needed an HOA to maintain property values and handle common area maintenance. I had drafted basic bylaws and covenants, but honestly, I had been so focused on the construction details that I never paid much attention to the governance structure. The HOA was supposed to be a simple organization that collected modest dues and hired a landscaping company to maintain the common areas. I figured the residents would elect reasonable people who would keep things running smoothly without causing any drama. As I unpacked my boxes that first evening, I stood on my deck watching the sun set over the lake I had gazed at thousands of times during construction. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the sky like a mirror. A family of ducks swam by, leaving gentle ripples in their wake. Everything felt perfect and peaceful. I had no idea that my quiet retirement was about to be interrupted by a woman who had turned my simple HOA into her personal kingdom. I had no idea that the bylaws I had hastily created would be used as weapons against the very community I had built with my own hands. That night, I fell asleep to the sound of water gently lapping against the shore, completely unaware that tomorrow would bring a confrontation that would change everything. Margaret Thompson had moved into Lakeshore Meadows 5 years earlier, and within 6 months, she had somehow maneuvered herself into the position of HOA president. She was a woman in her late 50s with perfectly styled gray hair and an expression that suggested she had never encountered a rule she did not want to enforce. Margaret had retired early from her job as a middle school principal, and apparently she missed having people to boss around. She had found her new calling in the world of homeowners association politics, where she could exercise authority over an entire neighborhood. Within her first year as president, Margaret had tripled the number of HOA regulations. She created rules about acceptable paint colors, mailbox styles, and even the types of flowers that could be planted in front yards. She established a system of fines for various infractions and appointed herself as the sole judge of what constituted a violation. The woman was obsessed with control. She drove through the neighborhood every morning at exactly 8 o'clock, looking for violations. She carried a notebook where she documented every infraction, no matter how minor. A trash can left out past collection day would result in a formal warning letter. A lawn that was slightly overgrown would trigger a citation. Margaret had transformed the monthly HOA meetings into trials where she would present her evidence against rule breakers and demand immediate compliance. She had managed to intimidate most of the neighbors into submission through her aggressive enforcement tactics and threats of legal action. The woman had absolutely no idea that she was living in a neighborhood designed and built by someone else. She talked about Lakeshore Meadows as if she had discovered it herself, referring to her community and her standards with the confidence of someone who believed she owned the place. On the morning that would change everything, Margaret was conducting her usual patrol when she spotted something that made her blood pressure spike. There was a pickup truck parked outside the lake cabin that had been empty for months. The truck was clearly a contractor vehicle, with ladders in the bed and construction company logos on the doors. Margaret immediately assumed that someone was doing unauthorized work on the property. She had very specific rules about construction projects and contractor vehicles. All work had to be pre-approved by the HOA board, which meant it had to be pre-approved by her. Contractor vehicles were not allowed to park overnight in the neighborhood. The sight of that truck sitting there like it belonged made Margaret furious. This was exactly the kind of disrespect for community standards that she had been fighting against for years. Someone was obviously trying to circumvent her authority, and she was not going to stand for it. Margaret parked her pristine white sedan and marched toward the cabin with her cell phone in hand, ready to document this blatant violation of HOA rules. She was prepared to take photos, issue citations, and if necessary, call the police to have the trespasser removed. She had dealt with rebellious homeowners before, but she had never encountered someone who would dare park a contractor truck in her neighborhood without permission. This was going to be a teaching moment for the entire community about who was really in charge. Margaret had no idea that she was about to confront the person who had created every rule she was planning to enforce. She had no idea that the truck belonged to the man who had built the very ground she was standing on. As she approached the cabin, Margaret was already composing the strongly worded letter she would send to the entire neighborhood about this incident. She was going to make an example of this situation that would ensure nothing like it ever happened again. I was unloading the last of my boxes from my pickup truck when I heard the sharp click of high heels on pavement. I turned to see a woman marching toward me with the determined stride of someone on a mission. She was impeccably dressed in a business suit, despite the fact that it was barely 9 in the morning on a Saturday. "Excuse me," Margaret called out in a voice that could have cut glass. "What exactly do you think you are doing here?" I set down the box I was carrying and looked at her with genuine confusion. "I am moving into my new home. Is there a problem?" Margaret stopped about 10 feet away from me and placed her hands on her hips. Her face was already flushed with anger, and I could see her jaw clenched tight. "This is a private residential community with very strict rules about unauthorized vehicles and commercial activity. You cannot just park that truck here and start unloading equipment." I glanced back at my pickup truck, which was clearly just a personal vehicle that happened to be sturdy enough for construction work. "Ma'am, I think there might be some confusion. I own this property. I just moved in yesterday." Margaret's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Oh, really? And I suppose you have documentation to prove that claim?" The way she said it made it clear that she did not believe me for a second. I could see that this woman was used to being in charge and having people immediately comply with her demands. Unfortunately for her, I was not easily intimidated. "I do have documentation," I replied calmly, "but I do not typically carry my property deed with me when I am unloading boxes. Can I ask who you are and why you are questioning my right to be on my own property?" Margaret drew herself up to her full height and spoke with the authority of someone who expected immediate respect. "I am Margaret Thompson, president of the Lakeshore Meadows Homeowners Association. It is my responsibility to ensure that all residents comply with our community standards and regulations." The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. This woman was using the HOA structure I had created to challenge my right to exist in the neighborhood I had built. But I decided to remain calm and reasonable, hoping we could resolve this misunderstanding quickly. "Mrs. Thompson, I understand your concern about maintaining community standards. I actually appreciate that you are looking out for the neighborhood. But I assure you that I am the legitimate owner of this property and I have every right to be here." Margaret was having none of it. Her voice rose to a level that I was sure the neighbors could hear. "I do not care what you claim. You are clearly some kind of contractor or worker, and you are in violation of multiple HOA regulations. If you do not leave immediately, I will call security." I looked around the quiet neighborhood and wondered what security she was referring to. "Ma'am, I think you should call whoever you need to call to verify my ownership of this property. I am happy to provide whatever documentation you require." But Margaret was already past the point of reasonable discussion. She pulled out her cell phone and started taking pictures of my truck, my license plate, and even me standing there holding a box. "You are refusing to comply with a direct order from the HOA president. This is going to be reported to the authorities." I watched in amazement as this woman worked herself into a complete frenzy over a situation that existed only in her imagination. She was taking photos like she was documenting a crime scene, muttering about violations and unauthorized activities. "Mrs. Thompson, I really think you should calm down and let me explain the situation." "Do not tell me to calm down," Margaret screamed. "You are trespassing on private property and I am calling the police right now." She dialed 911 with dramatic flair, turning away from me as if I might try to stop her. I stood there holding my box, listening to her report a trespassing incident with suspicious activity and unauthorized vehicles. Margaret was speaking loud enough for me to hear every word. She described me as a contractor who was refusing to leave private property and claimed that I was being aggressive and threatening. None of it was true, but she was putting on quite a performance. When she finished the call, Margaret turned back to me with a triumphant smile. "The police are on their way. I suggest you start loading your truck and get out of here before they arrive." I set down my box and looked at this woman who had just called the police on me for the crime of moving into my own home. "Mrs. Thompson, I am not going anywhere. When the police arrive, I will be happy to show them my property deed and clear up this confusion." Margaret's face went even redder. "We will see about that." 20 minutes later, 2 police officers arrived in a patrol car. I had spent the time sitting on my front porch, drinking coffee and watching Margaret pace back and forth on the street like a caged animal. She had been on her phone multiple times, apparently calling other neighbors to report the incident that was unfolding. The officers approached cautiously, clearly expecting to find some kind of disturbance. One was a young officer who looked fresh out of the academy, while the other was a veteran who had probably seen every type of neighborhood dispute imaginable. "Good morning, officers," I said, standing up from my porch chair. "I understand there has been some confusion about my presence here." Before I could say another word, Margaret rushed toward the officers with her arms waving dramatically. "Officers, thank goodness you are here. This man is trespassing on private property and refuses to leave despite multiple warnings from the HOA." The older officer, whose name tag read Sergeant Williams, looked back and forth between Margaret and me. "Sir, can I see some identification, please?" I pulled out my wallet and handed over my driver's license. "Of course. I should mention that I also have the property deed inside if you need to verify my ownership." Margaret's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly recovered. "He is probably showing you fake documents. This is clearly some kind of scam." Sergeant Williams examined my license carefully, then looked at the address on the house. "Mr. Mitchell, this license shows your address as matching this property. Do you have the deed available?" I nodded and went inside to retrieve the folder of documents I had prepared for the move. When I returned, I handed the sergeant a certified copy of the property deed showing that I had purchased the cabin 3 months earlier. The sergeant reviewed the document thoroughly, while the younger officer kept an eye on Margaret, who was becoming increasingly agitated. "Ma'am, this appears to be legitimate documentation showing that Mr. Mitchell owns this property. What exactly is your complaint?" Margaret's confidence began to waver, but she was not ready to give up. "Well, even if he owns the property, his truck is still in violation of HOA parking restrictions. Commercial vehicles are not allowed to park overnight in this neighborhood." The sergeant looked at my pickup truck, which was clearly a personal vehicle. "Mr. Mitchell, is this your personal vehicle?" "Yes, sir. I have been driving this truck for 8 years. It is registered to me personally, and I use it for my daily transportation." Margaret was getting desperate now. "But it has ladders and construction equipment. That makes it a commercial vehicle under our HOA bylaws." The sergeant handed my documents back to me. "Ma'am, unless there is a specific local ordinance that restricts personal vehicles based on their contents, we cannot enforce HOA parking rules. This appears to be a civil matter between neighbors." I could see the panic starting to set in on Margaret's face. Everything she had been so certain about was crumbling under the weight of actual facts and legal documentation. Officer, I have been the HOA president for 5 years. I know our regulations better than anyone. This truck violates multiple sections of our parking restrictions. The younger officer spoke up for the first time. Ma'am, do you have a copy of these HOA restrictions with you? Margaret's face lit up with renewed confidence. As a matter of fact, I do. I always carry a copy of our bylaws in my car for situations exactly like this. She hurried to her sedan and returned with a thick folder of documents. Here are the official HOA parking regulations for Lakeshore Meadows. You will see that commercial vehicles are strictly prohibited from overnight parking. I watched with growing amusement as Margaret began flipping through the pages, looking for the specific regulations she wanted to cite. She was so focused on proving her point that she had not stopped to consider the bigger picture. Here it is, Margaret announced triumphantly. Section 4.2 of the parking regulations clearly states that commercial vehicles, including pickup trucks with visible equipment, are prohibited from parking in the neighborhood between the hours of 6 p.m. and 8 a.m. The sergeant looked at the document she was showing him. Ma'am, these are definitely HOA regulations, but as I mentioned, we cannot enforce civil matters like this. You would need to pursue this through your HOA procedures. Margaret was not satisfied with this answer. But he is in clear violation of our community standards. Someone has to enforce the rules. I decided this had gone far enough. Mrs. Thompson, if you are so concerned about the HOA regulations, perhaps I should take a look at the complete set of documents. I would like to understand exactly what rules you believe I am violating. Margaret practically shoved the folder at me. Go ahead, read them all. You will see that I am completely within my rights to have you cited for these violations. I accepted the folder with a smile that I hoped she would interpret as resignation. Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. I appreciate your thoroughness in documenting all of these regulations. As I began to flip through the documents, I felt a familiar sense of recognition. The formatting, the language, even the specific terminology brought back memories of long nights spent in my lawyer's office 15 years earlier. That was when I found exactly what I was looking for. I stood there on my front lawn, holding the folder of HOA documents, while Margaret waited expectantly for me to admit defeat. The two police officers were clearly growing tired of this neighborhood drama, but they remained professional and patient. Mrs. Thompson, I said, looking up from the first page of regulations, these are certainly comprehensive rules. You have obviously put a lot of work into maintaining these standards. Margaret beamed with pride. I have spent countless hours ensuring that our community maintains the highest possible standards. These regulations protect everyone's property values. I nodded thoughtfully as I continued reading. I can see that. For example, this section about commercial vehicles is quite specific. It says that trucks with visible equipment are prohibited from overnight parking. Exactly, Margaret exclaimed. Your truck clearly has ladders and construction equipment visible, which makes it a commercial vehicle under our definition. The sergeant shifted impatiently. Folks, I really think you need to work this out through your HOA procedures. This is not a police matter. I looked up at the officers. Officers, I completely understand your position, but if Mrs. Thompson is going to enforce these regulations, I think I should understand the complete legal framework we are operating under. I turned back to Margaret. Mrs. Thompson, do you have the original HOA covenant and development agreements? I would like to see the foundational documents that establish the authority for these regulations. Margaret's smile grew even wider. Of course I do. I keep complete copies of all HOA documents in my car. I believe in being thoroughly prepared for any situation. She hurried back to her car and returned with an even thicker folder. Here are the original covenant and development agreements, along with all subsequent amendments and revisions. You will see that the HOA has full authority to establish and enforce community standards. I accepted the second folder with genuine appreciation. Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. I really do want to understand the full scope of the HOA's authority. As I opened the folder, I immediately recognized the document formatting and legal language. These were the same documents I had worked on with my attorney 15 years earlier. The same documents I had signed as the original developer of Lakeshore Meadows. This is quite interesting, I said, flipping through the pages. These original documents are very well drafted. The legal language is precise and comprehensive. Margaret puffed up with pride. I have always believed that strong legal foundations are essential for effective community governance. These documents give the HOA clear authority to maintain our standards. I continued reading, taking my time to review sections that I remembered helping to write. Mrs. Thompson, I noticed that these original documents reference something called developer reserved rights. Are you familiar with that section? Margaret's confidence wavered slightly. Well, those are just outdated provisions from when the neighborhood was first built. They do not really apply anymore since the development has been completed. I looked up at her with interest. Are you sure about that? The language here seems to suggest that certain developer rights are retained even after the completion of construction. The younger police officer spoke up. Sir, are you a lawyer or something? You seem to know a lot about these legal documents. I smiled. I have had to learn quite a bit about HOA law over the years. When you are involved in residential development, you encounter these issues frequently. Margaret's face was starting to show signs of concern. Mr. Mitchell, why are you so interested in the developer provisions? Those sections are not relevant to your parking violation. I found the page I was looking for and read it carefully. The language was exactly as I remembered it from all those years ago. Mrs. Thompson, this is fascinating. According to this document, the original developer retained certain rights and authorities that supersede normal HOA governance. Margaret was becoming visibly nervous. That is just legal boilerplate language. It does not mean anything in practical terms. I looked at the signature page of the original covenant. There it was, exactly as I remembered signing it 15 years earlier. My full name, clearly written in the same handwriting that appeared on my driver's license. Mrs. Thompson, I said quietly, I think you should look at this signature page. Margaret took the document from me and glanced at the signature. What about it? It is just the original developer's signature from when the neighborhood was built. I waited patiently while she read the name on the signature line. I watched her face as the reality of the situation began to sink in. David Mitchell, she read aloud. Then she looked at me with growing confusion. But that is your name. I nodded, yes, it is. Margaret looked down at the signature again, then back at me. Are you saying that you are the David Mitchell who signed these documents? I am saying exactly that, Mrs. Thompson. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the police officers were paying attention now, sensing that something significant was happening. Margaret's face had gone completely pale. You are the original developer of Lakeshore Meadows. I smiled at her. I am the person who bought the land, designed the neighborhood, built every house, and created the HOA structure that you have been using to govern this community. The moment of revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. She stared at the signature page, then at me, then back at the signature, as if she could make the reality disappear through sheer force of will. "You built this neighborhood," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded calmly. "I purchased 200 acres of raw land in 2007 and spent 2 years planning and developing lakeshore meadows. Every street you drive on, every house you see, every tree that was planted, and every regulation you have been enforcing came from my original vision and planning." Margaret's hands were shaking as she held the document. "But that was 15 years ago. Why are you here now?" "Because I always loved this particular property," I explained. "When it came back on the market, I decided to buy it and retire in the neighborhood I created. I had no idea that the simple HOA structure I established had been transformed into what you have created." The two police officers were watching this exchange with fascination. Sergeant Williams spoke up. "Mr. Mitchell, you are saying that you are the original developer of this entire community." "That is correct, officer. I can provide you with all the original development permits, construction documents, and municipal approvals if you need verification." Margaret was still staring at the signature. "This cannot be real. You are just some contractor trying to cause trouble." I reached into my wallet and pulled out a business card from my development company. "Mrs. Thompson, Mitchell Development Group has been my company for over 30 years. I have built 42 residential communities throughout the state." Margaret looked at the business card, then at my driver's license, then back at the signature on the covenant. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. "But if you are the original developer," Margaret said slowly, "then you created all these regulations I have been enforcing." I shook my head. "Actually, Mrs. Thompson, I created a very basic HOA structure with minimal regulations. Most of the rules you have been enforcing were added by subsequent HOA boards over the years." Margaret's face was turning red again, but this time it was from embarrassment rather than anger. "I have been the president for 5 years. I have worked so hard to maintain these standards." "I can see that you have been very dedicated," I said diplomatically. "But I think you should understand that as the original developer, I retain certain rights and authorities that are outlined in the covenant." I took the document back from Margaret and turned to the section about developer reserved rights. According to this section, the original developer retains the authority to modify HOA regulations, override board decisions, and assume control of the HOA if necessary to protect the integrity of the development. Margaret's mouth fell open. "You cannot be serious." "I am completely serious, Mrs. Thompson. These rights do not expire just because the development is complete. They are retained in perpetuity to protect the original vision and prevent exactly the kind of overly restrictive governance that you have implemented." Sergeant Williams looked at the document I was holding. "Mr. Mitchell, are you saying that you have legal authority to override this woman's HOA decisions?" "That is exactly what I am saying, officer. As the original developer, I have the authority to suspend HOA board members, modify regulations, and assume direct control of the association if I believe it is necessary." Margaret was staring at me with horror. "You cannot just come in here and destroy everything I have built." "Mrs. Thompson, I am not interested in destroying anything. But I am very interested in returning this HOA to its original purpose, which was to maintain common areas and preserve property values, not to micromanage every aspect of residents' lives." I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts. I think it would be appropriate to have my attorney join us to explain the legal situation in more detail. Margaret's panic was becoming visible. Wait, let us not involve lawyers yet. Maybe we can work something out. Mrs. Thompson, you were ready to involve lawyers 5 minutes ago when you thought you had authority over me. Now that you understand the real situation, you want to negotiate. The younger police officer was trying to suppress a smile. Sir, this is quite a turn of events. I looked at Margaret, who appeared to be on the verge of tears. Mrs. Thompson, I want you to understand something very important. Every rule you have been enforcing, every fine you have assessed, and every decision you have made as HOA president has been done without proper authority. Margaret's face went white. What do you mean? I mean that the HOA board has been operating beyond the scope of its original authority. The regulations you have been enforcing were never properly approved according to the original covenant requirements. I turned to a specific section of the document. Look at this section about regulatory changes. Any new regulations must be approved by the original developer or his designated representative. Were you aware of this requirement? Margaret shook her head slowly. No, I was not aware of that provision. Mrs. Thompson, this means that most of the regulations you have been enforcing are not legally valid. The fines you have assessed, the violations you have cited, and the penalties you have imposed have all been done without proper authority. The implications of what I was saying were clearly sinking in. Margaret could potentially face legal liability for her unauthorized actions over the past 5 years. Mr. Mitchell, Margaret said quietly, what happens now? I looked at this woman who had spent 5 years terrorizing my neighborhood with regulations I had never approved. Now, Mrs. Thompson, we are going to have a conversation about how this HOA is going to operate going forward. The transformation in Margaret's demeanor was remarkable. The aggressive, demanding woman who had called the police on me 30 minutes earlier was now standing quietly, wringing her hands and looking like she wanted to disappear. Mrs. Thompson, I said, as the original developer of Lakeshore Meadows, I am exercising my authority to immediately suspend your position as HOA president, pending a full review of all board actions over the past 5 years. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. You cannot just do that. I was elected by the residents. I showed her the relevant section of the covenant. According to this document, I absolutely can do that. The original developer retains the authority to suspend board members who exceed their authorized powers. Sergeant Williams had been listening to this entire exchange with growing interest. Mr. Mitchell, are these documents legally binding? They are recorded with the county and legally enforceable, officer. I can provide you with certified copies if you need them for your report. By this time, several neighbors had gathered on the street, drawn by the police cars and the obvious drama unfolding. I recognized a few faces from the original homebuyers 15 years earlier. Ladies and gentlemen, I called out to the growing crowd, I am David Mitchell, the original developer of Lakeshore Meadows. I have just moved into the lake cabin and discovered some concerning issues with HOA governance that need to be addressed. One of the neighbors, an elderly man named Frank who had been one of my first buyers, stepped forward. David, I thought that was you. Welcome back to the neighborhood. Margaret looked around at the neighbors who were greeting me warmly and realized that her reign of terror was truly over. This is not fair, she muttered. I have worked so hard to maintain standards. Mrs. Thompson, I said firmly, maintaining standards and harassing residents are two very different things. I have been hearing stories about your management style, and it is not what I intended when I created this HOA. I turned to address the gathered neighbors. I want everyone to know that I will be resuming active oversight of the HOA to ensure that it serves the residents rather than intimidating them. We will be reviewing all regulations and returning to the original purpose of maintaining our beautiful community. The crowd of neighbors began to applaud. Margaret looked around at the faces of people she had been bullying for years and realized that her support had completely evaporated. I will be calling an emergency HOA meeting for next week to elect new leadership and establish reasonable governance procedures, I announced. Everyone is welcome to participate in returning our community to its original vision. As the crowd began to disperse, Margaret approached me one last time. "Mr. Mitchell, I hope you understand that I was only trying to protect the neighborhood." I looked at this woman who had caused so much unnecessary drama and conflict. "Mrs. Thompson, protecting the neighborhood and controlling the neighborhood are not the same thing. I hope you can understand the difference." Margaret walked back to her car without another word, her head down and her shoulders slumped in defeat. The police officers finished their report and departed, shaking their heads at the strange turn of events. That evening, I sat on my deck watching the sunset over the lake I had gazed at thousands of times during construction. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the orange and pink sky like a mirror. For the first time in 15 years, I was home in the neighborhood I had built. And for the first time in 5 years, my neighbors could enjoy their homes without fear of petty harassment and arbitrary rules. It was exactly the peaceful retirement I had always envisioned.